Pathways to Prosperity Partnership and the Canadian Immigration Historical Society present Reflections from the Past.
Welcome to Raphael Girard. Raph, you were brought in as a director of Refugee Pairs between 1981 to 1988, and between 1988 and 89 you were the Director General of Refugee Pairs and Settlement. So I remember well because we were working together when you came in as Director of Refugee Pairs. And I'd like you to talk to me a little bit about what was the baggage that you brought into that job? What had you done before that set you up well? You'd been working in Europe, you had a lot of experience with asylum issues. Tell me a bit about the background that you brought to that job.
Well, I guess the first encounter I had was when Mike Malloy was appointed as the first director of Refugee Pairs. He had an office next to mine. I was director of selection. And it became quickly apparent with the number of people going in and out of his office, he had a much more interesting job than I did. But then I went abroad, and I was posted in Rome, and the biggest part of the program in Rome was resettlement of a number of different groups of refugees. I say that in quotes. We'll talk about whether or not they're real refugees later on. But there was a transit camp south of Rome that Canada had traditionally taken people from at Latina, and we had a quota of people to take each year. And that got me started. It wasn't long before we also had a second stream emerge, which were the Soviet Jewish immigrants from Russia and other republics of the Union. They were transiting through Rome en route to Israel, who decided in many cases they didn't want to go to Israel, and were then transferred to Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, wherever it was. There was resettlement opportunity. And a third group that we dealt with were Ethiopians and Somalis who were asyled in Italy and not really integrated into Italian society, but who needed, in some cases, to be resettled. So we started with small numbers of these Ethiopians and Somalis in our annual intake. I guess by '79, when the Indochina program was really starting to gain momentum, I was asked to go to Geneva and talk to the people at IOM about some operational support on the ground, because it quickly became apparent that in addition to identifying who was eligible to come to Canada out of the peripheral countries on the South China Sea, we needed people to transact the business, get the medicals done, get the travel documents, get people on planes, get them to Canada. And we ended up organizing a partnership with IOM.
IOM was the International Organization for Migration, which facilitated the movement of people at that time.
Yeah, they've been helping us with our Eastern Europeans out of Rome, so it was a natural expansion of the business. They were always open to doing more things for us because that was their business, and they were very efficient. Among the international organizations that we dealt with, IOM was certainly one of the most useful.
So you brought a lot of experience to the job as Refugee Affairs. And when you arrived, what was the situation in the Refugee Affairs branch at that time? Had it increased in number since Mike Malloy had been there?
Well, I arrived with the orientation that you get from working in a field like that the refugee program is resettlement. Well, it quickly worked out that it was a lot more than that, and that there were any number of other things that you had to deal with. The actual size of the unit, yourself and one other officer and the secretary, with the whole world as your domain. Big resettlement still coming out of Indochina, and the Eastern European program, an emerging Latin American program, plus all of the stuff that we had to deal with on asylum, which was something that you didn't get prepared for working in the field. Those kind of issues simply didn't emerge. In addition to having a pretty small unit and a very, very active number of programs within it, we had an activist minister. Lloyd Axworthy had been minister since 1980, so he was a year and something into the portfolio by the time I arrived. And he'd already commissioned a report on refugee policy using Jerry Robinson, a lawyer out of Vancouver, and Ed Ratushny at the Legal Aid Center at the University of Ottawa to do a report on the way forward on refugee policy, which had picked up on some of the missing issues from the Green Paper debate and from Immigration Act 1976. If you go back to those days, Immigration Act 1976 was based on a policy process that kind of dismissed asylum as a peripheral issue. It got limited coverage in the Green Paper exercise.
So the Green Paper was what led up to the 1976 Act?
That's correct.
Yeah.
That was 1973 to 1975 when Robert Andrus was minister and Alan Gottlieb was deputy minister. And it talked about Canada's role as a resettlement country. It talked about asylum as an issue for other countries, but not for Canada, because we simply weren't adjacent to some of the big sources of refugee movements. And it was felt our best role was helping the countries that were helping the first asylees by taking some of the burden off their shoulders. That, unfortunately, was quite at odds where the NGO community was in Canada. Even before Axworthy, they had been petitioning ministers to make Canada a country for asylum. And of course, most of the ministers they were dealing with had no idea what they were talking about. But they saw the issue as one of opening up Canada to people who could come spontaneously and get Canada's protection. Because they were looking largely at Latin America. They were looking at El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. Not even at Chile. Chile was farther afield, but the Latin American scene was difficult. They had many connections through some of the missionary work that some of the churches had done down there. There was a committee called the Interchurch Committee for Human Rights in Latin America, a very active committee out of Toronto, and included, the Anglican Church of Canada, the United Church of Canada, Christian Reformed, a number of the, I guess you'd say, the left-leaning intellectual community, and they wanted Canada to step up and help out because in the United States there seemed to be systematic rejection of any idea of giving asylum to people fleeing the dictatorships that, if not supported by the United States, were tolerated by the United States in situ.
So it was felt that the 76 Act didn't satisfy their what they felt Canada should be doing on the asylum front. And so this was what led Axworthy to sort of do this outside policy work, do you think? Or?
Yeah, he had an intellectual grasp of the issues on a scale that no other minister had up until his time, or probably subsequent to him. But he also had a very practical sense of what we could do. And so the findings that Robinson Ratushny brought to us didn't really go very far in the direction of where the churches wanted to go. They understood that we just couldn't open the border. They understood that, however, that the Refugee Status Advisory Committee, as it existed as a small administrative unit within the department, really wasn't going to meet the test of fairness that modern judicial practice demanded. But they certainly were not looking at big advances. They wanted incremental steps to make it more transparent, more accessible, and to make the results more credible to the NGO community, which with whom the relationship was coming more and more adversarial. You probably remember we organized a symposium in Toronto, I guess in the fall of 81 or 82, where we invited everybody who had something to say about refugees, and it was a whole weekend, a very, very interesting weekend, a lot of dynamics, a lot of good links forged, only have it all swept away when our chairman of our Refugee Status Advisory Committee had the final word that what he'd heard was all very good, but he certainly wasn't going to act on it. Kind of poisoned the atmosphere a little.
Those things can tip the balance very easily, and you were working in a highly politicized environment. So how did you find a way forward? Or the Ratushny paper, did that go somewhere?
Well, we were starting to work on how to operationalize things. We had all the resettlement stuff to do in the meantime. It was a very small unit, so progress was slow. In the meantime, the minister decided himself, without any consultation with anybody, to take the RSAC, the Refugee Status Advisory Committee, out of the department and make it an independent entity under Joe Stern, who was at the time his executive assistant. So it happened overnight. The previous head of the Refugee Status Advisory Committee went back to Foreign Affairs, and Stern then started building an independent apparatus to...
And so that ensured that people who were asking for asylum at our borders had a hearing.
Had a chance to make a claim, but it wasn't a face-to-face hearing. They would make a statement under oath. The paper would be adjudicated by members of the Refugee Status Advisory Committee, whose ranks were expanded by Joe and his people, and were then forwarded to a ministerial delegate for decision. Even at that time, even though the Refugee Status Advisory Committee had been legitimized in law, as Mike Molloy had pointed out, there was no connection between a positive decision and anything else. You're recognized as a refugee in Canada, it gave you no rights, except protection against being sent away. It didn't allow you to land in Canada or get any benefits or have any place in the system. So there were several disconnects with the situation. The progress probably would have been a lot more rapid and a lot more integrating of the NGO's point of view, but Axworthy was shuffled off to the Treasury Board, and he was replaced by John Roberts. Roberts did not have the same kind of interest in the issues of the day. He had a very strong sense of political survival as he was in a swing riding in downtown Toronto. So he consulted with the deputy minister, Gaetan Lucier, and they decided to give a contract to Gunter Plout to look at the system and come up with another approach to refugee determination that could be legislated. The Plout report wasn't received until there had been an election in 1984, when the Tories were swept out of office and replaced, when the Liberals were swept out of office and replaced by the Tories. And the recipient minister was Flora MacDonald. This would be late 84, early 85. Before we could get very far on that, though, we had the decision in Satnam Singh, landmark decision of the Supreme Court looking at refugee determination in Canada. They had looked at the Refugee Status Advisory Committee, the right of appeal of people who were rejected at that level to the Immigration Appeal Board, which simply considered the documentary evidence to either confirm the decision or overturn it, and decided that it lacked procedural fairness. And so the majority opinion written by Bertha Wilson indicated that fundamental justice required an oral hearing so that the claimant could have an idea of the case against him or her, and they were able to respond to it. So overnight, the process had to provide for an oral hearing by a decision maker. The IAB had the ability to do that.
And the IAB was the appeal?
The Immigration Appeal Board. Yeah. The Immigration Appeal Board had the capacity to do it, but they had a statutory limit of 10 members.
So just go back a bit and explain the connection between the Refugee Status Advisory Board as it was operating and the Immigration Appeal Board, so that's clear.
Okay, the Refugee Status Advisory Committee pronounced on the claim based on its evaluation of the statement under oath. That was then given to a ministerial delegate who ratified the decision. About 20% of the claims were accepted through that process. 80% were denied, and before being removed from Canada, the appellant had an opportunity to have the decision, the rejection of refugee status, revised by the Immigration Appeal Board.
The Immigration Appeal Board was part of the department at that time.
It was an independent entity, it was a tribunal, but it was legitimized under the Immigration Act. When the Immigration Act 76 was promulgated, it incorporated what had been the Immigration Appeal Board Act. So the same minister, same piece of legislation, but there was no direct connection, no line of authority from the department over the board. The board was independent.
What percentage of that 80% that were rejected would actually end up at the appeal board at that time? Do you remember?
I have no idea, but in that the reason for many of the claims was delay, most of them. The source countries for these claims were not the hotspots on the globe that were producing refugees. We were getting claims from Americans, from Swedes, from Swiss, and people from other democracies, because it bought you time in the system. And the more claims were accumulated, the more time you got, simply because you were in that system. The assumption was that almost all of the claims that were made that were rejected would probably go to appeal.
So go back to the Singh decision and the need then to look at oral hearings, and the significance of that was huge.
That's right, because of the statutory limitation on the size of the board. If all of the people in the backlog had opted for an oral hearing, the delay for a hearing, given that current rate of productivity, would have then extended from 1985 into the 21st century. So what it meant for the department was a total loss of control of the border. Anybody who wanted to come into the country simply had to say, I'd like to make a refugee claim. And they would then go into this impossible queue. And those who were deemed to be, a threat to Canada could be detained, but only that. Mm-hmm. And we couldn't detain en masse simply because it's not fair, it's not just, and we didn't have the system to do it. So Flora MacDonald convened a committee very quickly and directed that a task force be formed to produce a new refugee determination system within 6 months. And I was put at the head of it. And that's when we started really going through the process of designing a new system. Plout had made some proposals, but it was heavily process-driven. He looked way past the essential policy issues. So one of the things we did, we looked at what is the obligation of a signatory country to the Geneva Convention of 1951 and its protocol of 1967. And as been pointed out before, the obligation is very small. The only thing a signatory country cannot do is remove a refugee to a country where they have a well-founded fear of persecution on the 5 elements of the definition. There is nothing else that obligates a country in terms of those requirements. So we looked at how do you unclog, because even with a very simple administrative system, dispatch was not available. And when you did the analysis of even that system, there were at least 9 levels of review and appeal involving the federal court and occasionally a claim to leave to appeal to the Supreme Court. There was absolutely unfettered access. An inquiry would be held when a person first arrives because they're an immigrant, they arrive with no visa. So they're immediately in a situation of jeopardy vis-a-vis the Immigration Act. So the inquiry is held, it's determined they don't have a right to remain in Canada as immigrants, and that's the first stage. That decision then is appealed to the Federal Court of Canada, Trial Division. The Trial Division rejection is then taken to the Appeal Division, and then it goes back to the adjudicator. Said, okay, the order is in good shape. The person concerned then decides they want to make a refugee claim. All right. The claim goes to our Refugee Status Advisory Committee, then to the Immigration Appeal Board. Negative decision, Federal Court Trial Division, Federal Court Appeal Division. After that, there's a humanitarian review. Leave to appeal the Supreme Court.
Years.
Yeah, absolutely, years. And the timing of all of these hearings is in the hands of the appellant and the counsel. If they decide they want an adjournment, they usually get it. So you can stretch a hearing out forever if you're so inclined. And I think the record holder is Mohammed Issa Mohammed, who is still here after 27 years, even though we have film footage showing him executing the pilot of the Olympic Airways jet that he was on in Athens airport. So the design team quickly concluded that the essence of the challenge isn't to design a quick working system. The essence is to find a number of access filters that adhere to the policy the government has decided on, that we are not going to open up as a country of first asylum writ large. We will uphold our obligation under the convention, but we're not going to make it easy for people to come and claim. And so the design team looked at a very simple one-tier system, buffered by access controls. concept of safe third country was the cornerstone. See,
Just explain how
Yeah.
what that concept means.
yeah, there are people who can engage Canada's protection obligation because of the situation they're in. Somebody inbound on a flight from Haiti, direct from Port-au-Prince, can engage our protection obligation because that's the only opportunity they've had to claim asylum. Somebody at Fort Erie is already in a country that is signatory to the Geneva Convention, so they don't have the same claim on Canada for protection. It would be legitimate under procedural rules, under procedural fairness, and under the obligation we have under the convention, simply to say to that person, you want to be a refugee, make your claim in the United States. And so that's what we call the safe third country. We couldn't say that to an American. You know, if an American said, I want to be a refugee, you'd have to deal with it. But if a person was a Sri Lankan or a Guatemalan or a Salvadoran, it would be legitimate, both in legal terms and in policy terms of the time, simply to say to that person, make your claim where you are, not where you want to be. The other thing, of course, was interdiction. We would interdict in airports, funneling people through to Canada from Europe, because all of those countries are signatory. If the people who were attempting to get to Canada to claim wanted to engage Canada, it would be as resettlement cases, not as people trying to engage our protection obligation. Other issues, a bit more delicate to deal with. People inbound from Asia, you would probably allow those people to claim because while there are some signatory countries out there, their performance under their obligation under the convention, at least at the time, was not reassuring. Anyway, that was the idea. We frankly put less effort into designing the system of hearings than we did into the system of filters. And even with that, I think we did 30 cabinet documents, and we missed the 6 months by about 3 years. We went to cabinet time and time again, trying to get direction from the government on which set of options they wanted. There was never any question about a complex, multi-tiered asylum process. It was always on the filters. There was a great sort of divide at cabinet as to which countries were safe. Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Foreign Affairs made it quite clear that the first country on the list of safe third countries was going to be the United States. And the immigration minister who had to sign off said that if the United States was on the list, she wasn't going to sign. So those were the difficulties.
And her reasoning was?
Well, she saw what they were doing to Salvadorans in Guatemala. And it was being clear that there were two sets of rules being applied in the United States by the US INS, and some of them were being corrected by the circuit courts. The circuit courts were coming down quite heavily on some of the abuses in American practice. But it didn't give you any confidence that the United States was safe for some of these genuine refugee cases. The sanctuary movement had grown up in Western United States,
Right.
Housing these refugee claimants who weren't getting due process in churches and things like that, which just drew the spotlight to the issue.
Just stop for a minute and explain a little bit what happens when you're going to cabinet so frequently like that, and the effort that is required to make a cabinet paper, to have input for a cabinet paper. You have to have, you are required to get people to come and be on side from the outside. So the community, the people, the advocacy groups have to state their position in the cabinet paper. So each time you went through this process, you were having to adjust to the political situation, to the advocacy situation, and to what you knew would work or would not work. So how do you manage all of this in that period of time?
Well, it was very stressful. We certainly had a large number of consultations with the NGOs. The Interchurch Committee, which had reformed as the Interchurch Committee Concerned for Refugees, the ICCR, had formed an alliance with the Immigration Bar. Mainly at the beginning, Barbara Jackman and Norm Walnut. And their success with Singh gave them a lot of confidence that they were going to be able to, if they couldn't move us, they could at least move us through the courts. But they were very doctrinaire. The very strong proposal to one minister, I recall, was to drop the visa requirement on Guatemala, so that Guatemalans could stream forward to Canada and make their claim. The minister asked me what he thought the reaction of the department would be if he did that. I said, you'd probably be sued for negligence of your portfolio. The biggest country for illegal migration in the United States after Mexico is Guatemala. It was very clear that there would be no justification using conventional appraisal techniques to exempt Guatemalans from having to have a visa to come to Canada as visitors. And we showed we were able to do things in Guatemala that simply took the NGO's breath away. The shop steward for the union in the Coca-Cola bottling plant in Guatemala City was gunned down on the street in front of our embassy. We had him in Wellesley Hospital in Toronto the next day. So we could move. The political prisoners and oppressed persons designated class gave us the tools we needed. And we had an inspired leadership on the ground. We were giving sort of witness protection to Guatemalans who had the courage to testify against the military. This is all part of the package in trying to bring about reform. But we weren't going to open up and just let any Guatemalan who wanted to come and claim do so, because that wouldn't guarantee getting the right people to begin with, and secondly, it would be an impossible burden on the system.
How many people was it a large number that we brought out? It was fairly select in terms of people who really needed to move quickly.
Yeah, it was a handful. Out of Salvador, when we did the political prisoners program, who've been amnestied by Duarte, I think we took 197 families. But this is a big issue for the department and for the collaborating groups, because each one of these families desperately stressed and having been out of circulation, needed a lot of help. These weren't the conventional kind of resettlement cases that we were accustomed to helping. They needed psychiatric help in many cases. They needed rehab. They needed medical care, dental. They needed
we had community help in those kinds of cases as well.
Yeah, we did.
We were able to give them support when they got here.
Yeah, the Christian Reform in southwestern Ontario did a particularly good job with this group. But as I say, we could do a lot through outreach that we wouldn't have been able to do by just letting people spontaneously come as refugees. When X was considering the options, resettlement versus asylum, he went to Honduras, visited Mesa Grande, one of the big camps for refugees from El Salvador. And he went to Nicaragua, he went to Guatemala. He didn't go into Salvador itself because the civil war was raging. But when he came back, he just said, look, resettlement's not an issue. He said, I asked the people at Mesa Grande who wanted to come to Canada. Nobody.
Silence.
Where they wanted to go was back over the border so they could go home. And so that the essence of the effort was to try and make it possible for that to happen. But he did pick up on this need from within Salvador to bring out amnestied prisoners who having left jail, were then fair game for the assassination squads. So they were out of the frying pan into the fire and had to leave. Indeed, I think we lost more than one applicant who ended up being murdered before they could leave under our auspices.
If you look at the really intense policy world that you lived in, and the really big issues that you had to deal with in trying to make sense of the balance between our humanitarian objectives, our Geneva Convention obligations, and the pressures that we were starting to feel as people knocked at our door more and more. I mean, you went through 2 iterations of refugee policy papers from outsiders. You had all these attempts to go to cabinet. Where did you, at the end of your tenure in the job, where did you end up? Did you end up in a place that you were happy to be in as a policy position, or were you continually kind of having to peel back where you really wanted to be?
We kept on being moved off our game by events. We were never fast enough to get out ahead. In May 88, or May 87, we got the first reading of the Reform Bill, Bill C-55, which had a new determination system, a single tier, which had buffers through the safe third country concept, and a screening mechanism up front to make sure that the manifestly unfounded cases didn't even proceed to review.
Talk a bit about manifestly unfounded.
And it was to discourage people from using the system for delay. A number of high-profile American fugitives had used our system simply because it bought them some time. They couldn't be extradited while a claim was pending. So it was a very sort of low-level, very rapid test just to say, if you accept everything this person claims, is there any chance they're going to be a refugee? And if the answer to that is no, that's as far as it goes. They just go into the immigration inquiry process and, suffer the consequences of whatever that decision is. So the issue of trying to get that legislated was interrupted by the second boat that arrived off Nova Scotia. And so this had to be July 87. And I was called in from my holiday, and the deputy clerk of the Privy Council said to my boss and me, you're going to write up a decision of a cabinet meeting that hasn't taken place. And we're going to bring in another refugee determination bill to supplement Bill C-55. We have no idea what we want to have in it, but the bill has to be tabled in 6 weeks. And
That's exciting.
so then we started on putting together a bill to deal with boat arrivals, which became Bill C-84. And it only succeeded in slowing down the process on the bigger bill, Bill C-55, which had the...
What were the key provisions of C-84?
It was longer-term detention of multiple arrivals, search and seizure, shipboard determinations outside the 200-mile limit. It was a very draconian bill, but the public reaction to the second boat had been so intense it just scared the politicians, and they had to show that the government was toughening up. Ironically, when the bill actually was passed, we had a new minister who inserted a sunset provision for all of those new elements so that they never really had any impact on immigration practice.
And meanwhile, C-55 was chugging along.
That's right. And it was came into effect on January 1st, 1989, minus the buffers. At the last minute, the government decided not to proclaim safe third. And so the process was dead in the water from day one.
And So the filters were, as you say, more your focus for C-55, and you weren't in that bill dealing with the appeal processes and the various channels that people could go through to stay longer, or was there some provision in there at that time?
Well, what we'd done was we tried to delayer as much as we could. So we put in a single level of determination rather than determination and an appeal of that decision. But people still had access to federal court for judicial review. We put in a leave provision, so it wasn't automatic. And particularly going up from a negative at the trial division to the appeal division, we put in another leave provision so that the court itself could protect itself against frivolous requirements for judicial review. And so we delayered, but even then we knew it would take years to get through with a case where the person concerned didn't want to cooperate, because they were entitled to legal aid, and in the community, claimants got provincially insured medical care, they got welfare, they got permission to work.
Yeah.
So there's no incentive,
Right.
if you got a frivolous claim, to push it through fast. And there was no way we could compel people to attend. Every time we made an arbitrary decision on a claim because of delay, the courts overruled us. Denial of due process.
And even if you did get to the removal stage, we were having trouble removing people, were we not?
To some countries, yes. When we did the first run through on the design of status quo and new approach, we showed ministers that at the border and at the airports, they were finding 6,000 people a month had no right to come into Canada because they didn't have proper documentation. The removal process was less than 1,000 people a year. So you had 70,000 plus people being pushed into the removals process. The department going through massive amounts of process, but no product. We thought it would be cheaper just to give people a check when they arrived and said, here, enjoy it, because it would have been a lot cheaper and more effective than what we were doing.
And that problem has continued and exists. When you look at the fact that Bill C-55 was passed minus the safe third provision, the significance of that, and was that simply because they couldn't agree on which countries should be on the list, or was it the concept itself you think that politically was unpalatable?
It was the agreement on the list. We've been through several cabinet meetings with Justice when the ministers went at that. Is it fair? Is it charter approved? And the consensus was that it was both. But there was this disconnect in the policy dialogue. The average Canadian had no idea what the policy issue was, and ministers didn't take any trouble to try and make them knowledgeable. When we had the parliamentary hearings on Bill C-55, both in the House and in the Senate, no minister ever appeared. Official did all the work. I did most of it. So it became an official's bill, not a bill that was getting across to people an essential piece of policy that they were proud of. They wanted, most ministers wanted to stay as far away from this one as possible because there was simply no votes in it.
I guess, when you think about trying to explain how the policy-making process works in government to people who aren't part of government, even to people who are very active advocacy members of advocacy groups, how do you ever make it clear that this is such a complicated process and there are so many layers, and that you can only move things so far as an official, and yet you have to stand and defend the positions that have been taken? How did you manage that that continuing sort of process of trying to manage outside, manage inside?
It was, question of balancing all the time. You know, we had NGOs out there who were in many ways partners, and who had a big stake in all of the processes, and with whom you had to maintain, you know, a respectful relationship. But on the other hand, you had issues where there was substantial disagreement and where there wasn't going to be much accommodation. And I always took the view that, you know, you couldn't personalize these kind of discussions. I was there as a representative of the government, not as me, Raphael Girard. And there were some people who couldn't make the distinction, who personalized the interchange and blamed officials for herding ministers in directions where officials thought they should go and where the general public might want something different. You know, they were wrong. I don't think there was ever a situation where we were taking a line that ministers would rather not have, but you know, it weren't issues that they were going to stand up and defend in public all that much, because it's, you know, unpopular. It still is. Current Minister Jason Kennedy is doing better than many people with a lot tougher line than some of his predecessors have taken. But the opening, you know, we went to the congresses, we went to conferences, we subjected ourselves to a lot of really tough questioning, a lot of media where people were hostile, because, you know, it was our duty to get the word out and what we were doing. It was a comfort to know, however, that, as Mike Lloyd pointed out earlier, that Canada was in the forefront in so many of these areas, that nobody had a better package for helping refugees than we did.
Well, talk a bit about that. I mean, during all this intense policy work, you were also connected to the very, all the United Nations groups that were talking about asylum and talking about refugees. So clearly, you probably had some support from other countries. You had continuing discussions with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Was that a supportive environment for you as you went through this policy conundrum?
In some ways, yes, and we could also see that nobody had systems that tried to deal with making the process efficient.
Yeah.
You know, anybody who had a system had a backlog, and because of the same process, overload and inability to move things along quickly. We didn't get much support from the protection division at the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, because they were the keeper of the grail. You know, and they spent more time criticizing countries like Canada that were trying to do well in good faith than they were the real malefactors out there who were not protecting refugees at all, and doing, you know, terrible things in refoulement and launching refugees into orbit because they couldn't touch down at any airport or any place that would you know, let them into their territory. And you know, so I found that a bit difficult to bear. But I remember when we got the first results from I guess a few months of work of the new Immigration and Refugee Board that was applying the new process under Bill C-55. We had a meeting with the then High Commissioner for Refugees, a Swiss fellow, and he said, acceptance rates of 80%, he said. Sure he is. And this was to Barbara McDougall. Hockey was his name. He was absolutely contemptuous of our process. Not critical, he was contemptuous. Because
80% wasn't good enough.
No, 80% was such a ridiculous distortion of need that they didn't want to have to explain to other countries that, you know, Canada's bar is so high that nobody should ever aspire to go there.
What was happening in Australia and UK? Because we always quite closely connected ourselves to what they were doing. Were they doing anything different? They were facing the same problem. Well, Australia was certainly same pressures.
Yeah, and you know, again, they were trying to find their way without the same kind of experience that we had had and the same kind of operational expertise that we were able to muster. The Australians were better at it than the British, but being farther away and being able to manage the filters, you know, they were essentially working from the same conceptual base we were. You know, they felt that anybody who got onto the territory of the country was going to be there for a good long time, so the effort was designed to deny people access. And whereas the British, they were, you know, a victim of their own geography, and they tried some rather draconian methods, large-scale internment, arbitrary approaches, I think, to the hearings, and they lost control of it when the courts overruled them in terms of the fairness of their approach. It was interesting to see in the United States, with a number of reversals because of judgments of the Supreme and Circuit Courts, their approval rates started to close the gap. You know, they were coming up from about 25%, coming up toward 50%, and we were trying to find a way to ratchet down the numbers from the impossibly high level that the new Immigration and Refugee Board started out with. I went to the very first hearing of a determination by the board in Toronto. It was a lady from one of the countries of Latin America who in her testimony confirmed that her claim was absolutely manifestly unfounded. There was not a shred of relationship between her claim and the Geneva Convention. They accepted the claim from the bench. And I thought, there's no tomorrow.
Well, it's a problem that, you know, when we trace it through how it's evolved and how it is today, it's very interesting. And looking at the period where you were involved, which was so active and so intense, really, and which really began, that was the beginning of the refugee backlog situation, and the fact that attempts to make different access issues or different filter issues be active and useful didn't necessarily always work. But
that's where they are now. If you look at all of the recent moves, it's also interdiction, filters, and delayering, and that's exactly what we were at in mid-80s. Just they're now in a situation where the legal establishment and the mood of the country is more accepting.
Were there cost considerations? I mean, whenever you go to cabinet, you put costing in. But was this an issue? Because, you know, you go back, Mike saying that trying to, in fact, do oral hearings or do something like that was going to be $35 million. You clearly must have had huge costing issues.
Well, after we got the bills through, and I went to London on posting, Harry Anglin, who'd been the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury Board, came through London, and he asked me to go to lunch. And so we had this nice lunch, and I said, Perry, this has been nice, but why are we having lunch together? He said, I just wanted to meet the guy who broke the fiscal framework. We had sopped up all of the money that they had managed to skim off other departments in the interest of austerity, and we'd spent it on the refugee determination system and on support to claimants.
Well, I'm glad you put it in context, because that's you know, we haven't talked a lot about costing, but it's a big factor. We have a few minutes left. I want you to just spend a little time reflecting on that very intense period, how much energy and passion and you know, caring you put into it, and when you look back, how do you consider it? What are the issues and the themes that come out of it? What are the things that you learned that you carry through the rest of your career and you think are important for us now?
It's the, you know, the real, I guess, problem of trying to do something for the, you know, oppressed and downtrodden out there, being opposed tooth and nail by people who share your objectives. We could never get on the same track, and you know, we in the government and among officials, were limited by practical and economic realities. Our adversaries in the community always wanted the perfect. They weren't going to settle for the good. And you know, this was really in a situation where the perfect was the enemy of the good. So we spent so much time out there struggling to get a consensus that was never achieved. When in fact, had we been able to work more closely together, we could have done better. They blamed us for the killing of a Guatemalan girl who we tried to get out. We'd authorized a minister's permit, and it was partly their arrogance that exposed her to a threat that ultimately, ended up in her being murdered. You know, our proposal to the NGOs was as following: get her over the border. There'll be a permit waiting for her wherever she can get to, and we'll bring her to Canada. They decided to take her out through the main airport in Guatemala City. She was arrested, and that was the last anybody saw of her until her body was found in the garbage dump of Guatemala City. You know, they were ideological, hard-headed, stubborn, unfeeling in that sense, in terms of the kind of limitations that we had to work with. When we could work together, we could do good things, but it didn't happen often. I look back on that as a draining, exhausting time emotionally, physically. It was probably one of the toughest jobs that I ever did in my career, and part of it was that continuing pressure of having, being slanged in the press, in the House, in poison pen letters to the minister. When this wasn't a regime that we officials had dreamed up. This is something the government required of us. I'll close on one dramatic afternoon meeting in August '88 when Benoit Bouchard, who was responsible for the bill, called me and he said, there's an urgent meeting at the Langevin Bloc cabinet, and it's been convened by the deputy clerk. The issue is that Bill C-55 isn't going to do it, so we're going to have to go to a notwithstanding clause to deprive people of charter rights. He said, I want you to know going in that if it goes against me, I oppose this. If it goes against me, I'm going to resign at the table. So whatever you do after that is up to you. So we went into this cabinet meeting, convened behind our backs by powers more powerful than ourselves. was going to trash our bill and bring in an absolutely draconian piece of stuff. And it wasn't clear from the people at the table how the vote was going to go. And they asked for the legal advisor to Foreign Affairs to speak about Canada's obligation. And who got up and said the following. He said, Canada doesn't have any unescapable legal obligations to refugees. You only cause a problem by determining somebody to be one. So if you just send them away, you don't have the problem. Don't determine the claim. So Bouchard said, you know, Raph, would you please tell the ministers what you think of the intervention from Foreign Affairs? I said, it's bizarre. I said, anybody who has any sense of international law? Refuginess isn't conferred on somebody, it's implicit in the individual. If you have a well-founded fear, you are a refugee. Not because somebody says your well-founded fear is legitimate. So you can't cop out by not hearing a claim. We won the vote by 1 vote.
Amen to that. Raph, thank you so much. It's been truly fascinating, and I appreciate everything that you've shared with us, and I know it'll be fascinating to others as well. Thank you.